In the long twilight of the 6th century before Christ, when the known world stretched from the misty lands of the Celts to the burning plains of Persia, a storm was gathering. Empires had risen and fallen before, but none had risen so vast, so inexorable as that of the Persians. Born from the mountain tribes of the Iranian plateau, their kings, Cyrus, Cambyses, and now Darius, had woven an empire that seemed eternal. From the Indus to the Aegean, from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Armenia, their dominion was absolute. Cities bent the knee, kings offered tribute, and nations whispered the same name in awe and fear, the Great King. Yet far to the west, beyond the Ionian coast, across the wine-dark sea, there lay a people who bowed to no king. The Greeks were many and divided, quarrelsome as brothers, proud as gods. Their cities, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, were small by Persian standards, but within their walls burned something that the great king could neither buy nor command: freedom. It was not yet the freedom of modern tongues, but a fierce independence, a refusal to be ruled by another's hand. And it was this spirit, more than numbers or wealth, that would one day defy the greatest power the world had ever seen. The spark came not from Athens herself, but from her cousins on the coast of Asia Minor. In Ionia, Greek cities had long lived under Persian rule, paying tribute to satraps and kings. For years they endured it, until at last they rose in rebellion. In 4999 BCE, the Ionian revolt burst like fire through the Aegean. Miletus, Ephesus, Sardis, all became battlegrounds. The Athenians, stirred by kinship and pride, sent ships and men to aid their brethren. Together they burned Sardis, one of the great Persian cities. It was a defiance that echoed all the way to Susa, the royal capital, where Darius the Great sat upon his throne. When news reached him that a faraway city called Athens had dared lay hands upon his empire, the great king asked for clarification. "Who are these Athenians?" he is said to have asked, for their name meant nothing to him. But he would remember it. The chroniclers say he ordered a servant to stand beside him at every meal and whisper, "Master, remember the Athenians." And so, from that day, a new campaign began. Not merely a campaign of conquest, but of vengeance. Years passed as the empire gathered its strength. Persia's armies were endless, men from every nation under heaven, Medes, Bactrians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Lydians, and more, marched beneath the banners of Darius. The Persian navy, too, was vast, drawn from the finest sailors of the Eastern world. Yet beyond the horizon, in their small, quarrelsome cities, the Greeks paid little heed. They had no notion of the storm that was coming. By 492 BCE, the first wave of invasion had begun. A Persian force swept through Thrace and Macedonia, subduing them in turn. But when their fleet was shattered by storms off Mount Athos, the invasion faltered. Darius was undeterred. 2 years later, in 490 BCE, he sent a new armada, 600 ships it is said, carrying perhaps 25,000 men, to punish Athens and her ally, Eretria. The fleet was commanded by Datis and Artaphernes, veterans of the royal court. They sailed across the Aegean, burning and subduing the islands as they came. When they reached Euboea, they destroyed Eretria after a brief siege, enslaving its people as a warning to all Greece. Then they crossed to the mainland, landing on the plains of Marathon, a wide, open field 26 miles northeast of Athens. Marathon, its very name would one day echo through time. But in that moment, it was merely a quiet valley, bordered by mountains and sea, where farmers tilled the soil and herds grazed beneath the sun. To the Persians, it was the perfect ground for their cavalry, a place to crush the Greeks in open battle. To the Athenians, it was both a threat and an opportunity. When word reached Athens that the Persians had landed, the city trembled. They had never faced such an enemy, an empire of tens of nations, seasoned in conquest, led by generals of the great king. Yet Athens did not yield. The assembly met and resolved to fight. From every quarter of the city men took up arms, citizens, craftsmen, farmers, all bound by oath to defend their land. Their general was Miltiades, a man who knew the Persians well, for he had once served under their command before turning against them. He understood their strength, but also their flaws. He counseled swift action. "Let us meet them at Marathon," he urged, "before they march upon our walls." And so, the Athenian army marched east, 10,000 hoplites armored in bronze, their shields gleaming in the sun, their long spears in hand. From the distant hills, they looked down upon the Persian camp, a sea of tents stretching across the plain, and beyond them, the glittering ships anchored along the shore. Against such numbers they seemed few, but they were not alone. From the rugged valleys of the Peloponnese came a small band of warriors from Plataea, a city of no great size, but of immense courage. They had marched to stand beside Athens in her hour of need, and their presence became legend. 11,000 men now faced the might of Asia. For days, the two armies watched each other. The Persians waited, confident that fear would break the Athenians, or that their cavalry would soon force a decisive encounter. The Athenians, meanwhile, debated in council. Some argued for caution, others for immediate battle. Among them, Miltiades stood firm. "Every day we wait," he said, "the enemy grows stronger and our allies falter. We must strike now while they are unprepared." At last, the decision was made. But before they advanced, the Athenians sent a messenger, a runner named Phidippides, to seek aid from Sparta. He ran across the mountains and through the plains, covering nearly 140 miles in 2 days, until he stood before the Spartan council. Breathless, dust-covered, he delivered his plea. "Lacedaemonians, the Persians have landed at Marathon. We beg you, come to our aid." The Spartans were willing but bound by religious law. The festival of the Carneia forbade them from marching until the full moon. "We will come," they promised, "but not before the moon is full." So the Athenians would stand alone, for now. When Phidippides returned with the news, the army did not despair. They prepared instead for destiny. At dawn on a fateful morning, Miltiades arrayed his men upon the slopes above the plain. The Persian line stretched across the valley, their center deep and dense with archers and infantry. The Greek line, by contrast, was thinner in the center, strengthened on the wings. Miltiades had devised a bold plan to draw the Persians inward and then envelop them from both sides. It was a risk, but one born of genius. The trumpets sounded. The Greeks began to advance, slowly at first, then faster, then at a run. The Persians were astonished. Never before had they seen men charge across open ground without fear of arrows. The sky darkened with shafts, but the Greek line held. Bronze shields clashed against wicker ones, spears met swords, men screamed, stumbled, died. The battle was chaos and thunder, dust and blood. On the wings, the Greeks pressed hard, driving the Persians back toward the sea. In the center, where the Persians were strongest, the Athenian line bent but did not break. Then, as Miltiades had planned, the wings turned inward, encircling the enemy. Panic swept through the Persian ranks, their discipline shattered. Many fled toward their ships, pursued by the victorious Greeks. The slaughter was immense. By the day's end, 6,000 Persians lay dead upon the field, while fewer than 200 Athenians had fallen. It was a victory so complete, so unexpected, that it resounded through the ages. Against all odds, a small city had humbled an empire. The great king's army had been repelled not by walls or numbers, but by courage and unity. As night fell upon the blood-soaked plain, the Athenians stood amid the fallen, their armor dented, their faces blackened with sweat and dust. They had done the impossible, yet even in triumph, there was no rest. For news came that part of the Persian fleet had sailed south, perhaps to attack Athens undefended. Without hesitation, the weary warriors marched back across the land, 26 miles to the city, arriving before the enemy could land. When the Persians saw the Athenian army awaiting them on the shore, they turned away. And so ended the Battle of Marathon, the first great clash between East and West, between empire and liberty. It was more than a military victory. It was a declaration that the free men of Greece would not be ruled. The message spread like wildfire. Across the Aegean, in every city and polis, men whispered of Marathon with awe. The Persians would come again, greater and more terrible than before, but Marathon became a beacon, a memory, a proof that courage could defy destiny. The field itself would become sacred ground, where the fallen were buried together beneath a great mound, and their names carved upon stone. And when travelers passed, they would see the tumulus rising above the plain and remember the day when a handful of men saved their world. But the story of Marathon was not yet over. The victory would echo far beyond the shores of Attica, shaping the destiny of Greece and the wars that followed. For Darius's wrath would not fade, and his son Xerxes would one day return with vengeance in his heart and the armies of a continent at his back. The age of Marathon was only the beginning, a dawn before the tempest, a promise written in blood and glory across the sands of history. When the dawn rose over the plain of Marathon, it revealed a world transformed. The smoke from the Persian ships had drifted out to sea, the cries of the wounded had faded into silence, and the morning light fell upon the bodies of those who had bought freedom with their lives. The mound of the dead stood like a scar upon the earth, Greek and Persian alike united in the stillness of death. For Athens, this was more than victory. It was awakening. The city that had once been just one among many had now defied an empire. And in that defiance, something new was born. The belief that courage and unity could triumph over tyranny, that the destiny of men could be shaped not by kings or gods, but by themselves. The Athenians buried their dead where they fell, raising a great tumulus that would endure for centuries. Beneath its soil lay fathers, sons, brothers, citizens who had stood shoulder to shoulder in defense of their polis. It was not the custom of Athens to bury its warriors upon the field, but Marathon was no ordinary battle. It was a shrine, a sacred memory, and upon its stones were inscribed words that would echo through time, that these men had died for the freedom of Greece. In the days that followed, the city celebrated its heroes. Pheidippides, the swift-footed messenger, who had run from Marathon to Athens with news of victory, was said to have collapsed and died upon delivering his message. His run would pass into legend, inspiring centuries later the race that bears the name Marathon. Whether the tale was true mattered little. It became the symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and devotion, the spirit of the city made flesh. Miltiades, the architect of victory, was hailed as a savior. Yet fame in Athens was as fleeting as the sea's foam. The city, though grateful, was fickle, and soon the same voices that had cheered his name whispered doubts about his ambition. Within a few years he would be accused of misconduct in a failed expedition against the island of Paros and die from a wound sustained in battle, his glory dimmed. But history would not forget him. The shadow of Marathon would always bear his mark. Meanwhile, across the sea in Susa, the great king sat in his palace, surrounded by gold and silence. When word reached Darius of the disaster at Marathon, it was said that he did not speak for a long time. He had believed his victory assured, that the tiny city of Athens would be crushed like an ant beneath his empire's heel. Instead, his army had been destroyed by men who fought not for tribute or power, but for their own freedom. Rage burned within him. He began at once to prepare a new invasion, vaster than before, one that would leave no Greek city standing. But the empire was vast, and rebellion was constant. In the east, the satrapies of Egypt rose against Persian rule, demanding his attention. Darius turned his armies there first, intent on restoring order before returning west. Yet fate intervened. Before he could march on Greece again, Darius the Great, King of Kings, Lord of lands and peoples, died. He left his throne to his son, Xerxes, a man of immense pride, vast ambition and unyielding purpose. For Athens, the years that followed Marathon were uneasy, but full of transformation. The city stood proud, yet aware that the Persian shadow still loomed. They knew the empire would return, greater and more terrible than before. The question was not if, but when. And so Athens turned inward, reshaping itself in anticipation of the storm. In the heart of the city, political currents shifted. The old aristocracies that had long dominated Athenian life began to yield to the rising power of the common citizen. The battle had shown that the strength of Athens lay not in its nobles, but in the united body of its people, the hoplite farmers, craftsmen and laborers who had stood together at Marathon. Out of that realization, democracy began to deepen its roots. The assembly gained new authority, the voice of the people grew louder, and the idea of isonomia, equal law, became the foundation of Athenian identity. Among those who rose in the years after Marathon was a man named Themistocles, a statesman of cunning mind and boundless vision. Where others saw the Persian threat as distant, Themistocles saw it as inevitable. He knew that when the great king returned, he would not come with a mere expeditionary force. He would bring the full weight of Asia. And when that day came, Athens could not rely solely on its hoplites. The city would need a navy, a fleet capable of meeting Persia upon the sea. In those years, fortune smiled upon Athens. Rich silver was discovered in the mines of Laurium, and a great debate arose in the assembly over what to do with the wealth. Many called for it to be distributed among the citizens, a momentary comfort. But Themistocles urged another path. "Let us build ships," he said, "for the enemy will come again." His vision prevailed, and Athens began to construct triremes, sleek, three-banked warships that would soon dominate the Aegean. What began as preparation for war became the foundation of an empire. Across the Aegean, the Persians watched and planned. Xerxes, newly enthroned, inherited not only his father's empire but his vengeance. From his palaces at Persepolis and Susa, he summoned nations to war. Messengers rode out across deserts and mountains, bearing the king's command, that every satrapy send men, ships, horses, and gold. The call was answered. From the Indus came Bactrians and Indians in bright armor. From Babylon, men with bows of horn and reed. From Egypt, warriors with shields of ox-hide. From the far north, Saka tribesmen with painted faces. The greatest host the world had ever seen began to gather. While the Persians assembled, the Greeks argued. Old rivalries between Athens and Sparta flared anew. Many cities preferred submission to destruction. Themistocles understood that only unity could save Greece, but unity among the Greeks was like trying to chain the wind. Envoys were sent to Delphi, where the oracle spoke in riddles. When the Athenians sought guidance, the priestess told them, "Fly, fly to the ends of the earth. All is lost." Despair swept through the city until Themistocles returned for a second reading, and the oracle's words changed. "Though all else is lost, the wooden wall shall not fail." Some interpreted the wooden wall as the palisades of the Acropolis, but Themistocles saw another meaning. The wooden wall, he said, was the fleet. The sea would be Athens' salvation. He persuaded the people to trust in ships rather than stone, to place their future in the hands of sailors rather than priests. And so the harbor of Piraeus became a forge of destiny, its docks alive with the sound of hammers and the scent of pitch. Even as Athens built, the memory of Marathon remained their guiding star. It was more than a battle. It was a promise, a reminder of what free men could achieve when united. Poets sang of it, sculptors carved its heroes in marble. Fathers told their sons of the day when Athens stood alone and triumphed. Marathon became the measure of courage, the touchstone of Greek identity. Yet among the Persians too, the memory endured, but as a wound, not a glory. In the great halls of Susa, Xerxes listened to the accounts of his father's defeat. Advisors urged caution, warning him of the Greek terrain, the narrow straits, the treacherous winds. But Xerxes' pride was immense. He believed the will of the great king could not be denied. The gods themselves, he thought, would yield to the empire of Persia. He ordered the construction of a bridge across the Hellespont, linking Asia to Europe, so that his armies might march unbroken into Greece. The world watched as men labored to bind the continents together. Ships were lashed side by side, ropes drawn taut, and wooden planks laid across their decks. But when storms destroyed the bridge, Xerxes flew into rage. He commanded that the sea itself be whipped with chains and cursed as a rebel. Then he built the bridge again, stronger, longer, and this time it held. The earth seemed to tremble beneath the march of his army, a river of men flowing westward toward Greece. And still, across the narrow seas, in the shining city of Athena, the people remembered the men of Marathon. Their names were recited at festivals, their graves adorned with garlands. They had proved that Persia could bleed. Now, as the new storm gathered, their victory became both shield and challenge. The Athenians had once stood alone. This time, they would not. The memory of Marathon bound the Greek world together in common cause. But in the quiet moments, when the fires burned low and the winds from the east carried the scent of strange lands, the question lingered. Had they truly changed their destiny, or merely delayed it? The gods were watching, the fates weaving, and beyond the horizon, the might of Persia was on the move once more. Marathon was victory, but it was also beginning, a spark that would ignite the inferno of the Persian wars. The names that would soon follow, Thermopylae, Artemisium, Salamis, Plataea, would all spring from the seed planted that day upon the plain. Marathon had shown what men could do. Now the world would see what they would endure. The years turned, and Greece lived in uneasy peace, as though the world itself were holding its breath. From the islands of the Aegean to the shores of the Peloponnese, men whispered of the empire assembling in the east. Tales spread like smoke, of bridges built over seas, of canals carved through mountains, of kings who commanded nations as other men commanded servants. The great king was coming, not with a raiding fleet or a token army, but with the full weight of his dominion. Xerxes, son of Darius, had spent years preparing his vengeance. To him, the defeat at Marathon was not merely a military failure. It was an insult to the throne of the gods on earth. His father had died with unfinished business, and Xerxes, though cautious in the early days of his rule, became consumed with the dream of conquest. The empire he commanded was vast beyond imagining. 70 nations, each bound by oath and tribute, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of the Hindu Kush. His armies numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps more, drawn from every corner of the known world. Herodotus, who would one day weave the tale of these wars, described the sight of Xerxes' host as though the earth itself had turned to march. There were Persians in bright-scale armor, Medes with their conical hats, Assyrians in iron helmets, Egyptians bearing long shields of oxhide, Bactrians with spears tipped in bronze, Ethiopians whose bows were as tall as a man. From the sea came the ships of the Phoenicians, the triremes of Cyprus and Cilicia, the galleys of Ionia, many crewed by Greeks now bound to the Persian yoke. When Xerxes reviewed his army at Sardis, he saw a sea of men and horses that stretched beyond sight. Streams and rivers ran dry where they drank, fields vanished beneath the press of their feet. To feed such a host was an empire's task. Yet still, the great king desired more. He would not merely punish Athens, he would erase it. He would make all of Greece bow to Persia's will. Before the march began, he sent heralds across the Greek world, demanding earth and water, the ancient symbols of submission. Many cities obeyed, for they had seen what defiance brought. But Athens and Sparta refused. They killed the heralds who came to them, casting their bodies into wells. "Take earth and water from there," the Spartans said, "if you wish." Thus, the final breach was made. There could be no peace, no compromise. The war that was coming would decide the fate of nations. In the spring of 480 BCE, the Great March began. Xerxes crossed from Asia into Europe over the bridge at the Hellespont. The sea bound beneath his feet. His engineers had chained the waves, and his soldiers trod upon planks of cedar and papyrus, as though walking upon the earth itself. Behind him came his fleet, following along the coast, a moving city of ships. Everywhere they passed, nations fell silent. The Macedonians submitted, the Thessalians yielded, and fear spread through Greece like plague. Only a few cities dared to resist. Among them stood Athens, guided by Themistocles' vision, and Sparta, proud and defiant, her warriors bound by the code of honor that valued death over surrender. Themistocles understood what few others did, that the war would not be won on land alone. The Persians were too many. To defeat them, the Greeks would have to control the sea. He urged the cities to form a league, a Hellenic alliance, and to meet the enemy together. Reluctantly, the rival cities agreed. Representatives gathered at Corinth, where they pledged to defend the freedom of Greece. It was a fragile unity, bound by fear as much as purpose, but it was enough. The Greeks debated where to make their stand. The northern pass of Tempe was abandoned as untenable. Then came word of a narrow defile between the mountains and the sea, a place called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, where the Persian numbers would count for little. There, the Spartans offered to hold the line while the fleet blocked the Persian navy at Artemisium. The plan was desperate, but so was their cause. As Xerxes advanced through Thrace and Thessaly, the Greeks took their positions. In the mountains, the Spartans, 300 chosen warriors under King Leonidas, prepared to meet the might of the Persian host. With them stood men from Thespiae and Thebes, a small band against an ocean. When Xerxes arrived and saw the narrow pass, he sent messengers demanding that the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas's reply became legend: "Come and take them." What followed at Thermopylae was slaughter and glory, the stand of the few against the many. For 2 days the Spartans and their allies held the pass, their bronze shields locked, their spears thrusting in rhythm, their discipline unbroken. The Persians hurled themselves against the wall of men and died in heaps. Even the immortals, Xerxes' elite guard, could not break through. But betrayal found its way into the Greek lines. A local named Ephialtes revealed a hidden path through the mountains. When the Persians encircled them, Leonidas dismissed most of his allies, remaining with his 300 to fight to the last. The Spartans fought until they were surrounded, their spears shattered, their swords broken, their hands clawing at their enemies with nails and teeth. When it was over, their bodies lay in a heap, and around them lay thousands of Persians. The pass was lost, but Thermopylae became a beacon. The message was clear: Greece would not submit. The defeat at Thermopylae opened the road to central Greece. Xerxes' army advanced southward, burning cities and temples. Athens was evacuated. Her people fled to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. When the Persians reached the city, they found it empty save for a few defenders on the Acropolis, who were soon cut down. Xerxes' soldiers set fire to the temples, and the smoke of Athens burning rose into the sky. From his throne upon the Acropolis, Xerxes watched the flames consume the city and believed victory was complete. Yet Themistocles had one final plan. He had gathered the Greek fleet, about 300 ships, smaller and fewer than the Persian navy, into the narrow straits of Salamis. There, the Persian numbers would become a hindrance rather than a strength. Xerxes, confident of victory, sent his fleet in to finish the Greeks. But the straits were treacherous. The winds shifted, the channels narrowed, and the Greek triremes, faster and more maneuverable, struck with precision. The battle became chaos. Oars snapped, hulls shattered, and men drowned in their armor. Themistocles' ships rammed and boarded the enemy, their rowers shouting the names of their cities and gods. From his throne upon the shore, Xerxes watched in disbelief as his navy crumbled before him. The sea that had carried his empire's power now carried its ruin. When the sun set over the waters of Salamis, the Persian fleet was broken. The great king's dream of conquest died upon the waves. Xerxes withdrew northward, leaving a portion of his army behind under his general Mardonius to continue the fight. The following year, the Greeks met the Persians again on the plains of Plataea, where once more the courage born at Marathon shone through. United at last, the Greek armies shattered the Persian force. Mardonius was slain, his troops scattered, and the invasion ended. The power of Persia receded beyond the sea, never to return in such might again. And so the circle that began at Marathon was complete. From that first victory on the plain to the final triumph at Plataea, the Greeks had faced the greatest empire the world had ever known and endured. They had paid dearly, in blood and ruin, but their freedom was intact. Yet even as the smoke cleared, the meaning of these wars began to shift. For Athens, the victory became not merely defense, but destiny. Themistocles' fleet, born of necessity, became the foundation of an empire. Athens rose from the ashes of her burned temples to become the greatest power of the Aegean, her democracy flourishing, her art and philosophy transforming the world. The spirit of Marathon and Salamis became the myth of Athens, the belief that free citizens, guided by courage and reason, could shape history itself. But there were others who looked upon that legacy with unease. Sparta, whose warriors had died at Thermopylae, grew wary of Athenian pride. The unity forged in war began to fray. Old rivalries returned. And in the distance the seeds of new conflicts were sown, the Peloponnesian Wars that would one day tear Greece apart. Still, for a brief, shining moment, the memory of Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis bound the Greeks together in triumph. Poets sang of their deeds. Playwrights turned their sacrifice into legend. Philosophers pondered what it meant for mortal men to defy fate itself. To later generations, Marathon was not merely a place but an idea, the moment when the free world first stood against empire. Centuries would pass, empires would rise and fall, but the echo of that stand would never fade. The Romans would look to Greece for inspiration, the Enlightenment thinkers would look to her ideals, and every age that valued liberty would trace its lineage back to that plain in Attica where bronze met empire and freedom was born in blood and fire. The Persians had come to subdue Greece, but in trying to crush her, they had awakened something greater, a civilization that would shape the mind of the world. From the ashes of Athens' temples rose the Parthenon. From the fields of Marathon grew the seeds of democracy. From the blood of the fallen came the vision of humanity's potential. And so, across the centuries, the name endures, Marathon, the clash that shaped the ancient world, the battle that taught men that even against the might of kings, the courage of the few can change the fate of all. In the quiet after the storm, when the ashes of war had settled and the gods themselves seemed to rest, Greece stood transformed. The fields that had once known the tramp of Persian armies now echoed with the sounds of rebuilding, of temples rising again, of ships returning to harbor heavy with spoils and song. The land had survived, and with it the idea that men could stand free. Yet victory is never only a moment. It is a memory, a story retold until it becomes greater than itself. And so Marathon began its second life, not as a battlefield but as a legend. In Athens they built their pride upon that plain. Each year, festivals were held in honor of the fallen, their names recited so none would fade from memory. The tumulus at Marathon became a place of pilgrimage. Beneath its mound lay 1,100 souls, buried together not as rich and poor, noble and common, but as equals, citizens united in death as they had been in battle. To stand upon that hill was to feel the weight of history pressing upward from the earth. The poets sang of it. Aeschylus, who had fought there himself, would later write that his greatest honor was not his plays, not his fame in Athens theaters, but the simple line engraved upon his tomb. Aeschylus of Athens, son of Euphorion, lies dead. His witness is the famous field of Marathon, and the long-haired Persian knows it well. That was the measure of glory, to have stood at Marathon when the fate of the world was in the balance. For the Athenians, Marathon became more than victory, it was proof of divine favor. They said the gods had fought beside them, that the hero, Theseus, had risen from the underworld to lead them, that the ghost of King Erechtheus had struck down the enemy, that the great war god Pan had appeared to Pheidippides on his run to Sparta, promising to sow panic among the Persians. Temples were built to honor those gods, and altars raised to the dead who had become heroes. The city's artists carved their triumph into stone, the Persian warriors in their soft robes and curved bows, the Greeks in their bronze and linen, their bodies taut with motion. On the friezes of temples, on the sides of drinking vessels, in the stories told to children, the memory of Marathon became eternal. Yet the memory was not without burden. For in celebrating their past, the Athenians began to measure all things by it. Every victory, every act of courage was compared to Marathon. It became a standard no age could quite surpass. When later generations faltered or argued, statesmen would invoke it as a rallying cry. Remember Marathon. And the citizens would straighten their backs, recalling the glory of their ancestors. It was not merely history, it was identity. The Persians too remembered. Though their empire remained vast and their kings powerful, the defeats in Greece wounded their pride. They had faced men who fought for no master, who took orders not from kings, but from their own assemblies, and that defiance baffled them. In the courts of Susa and Persepolis, the Greeks became both a warning and a fascination. The East had met the West, and neither would ever forget the other. For centuries after, the Greeks would look back on those wars as the defining moment of their civilization, the line that divided freedom from servitude, courage from submission. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea became a litany of faith, recited not to gods, but to the idea of arete, excellence of spirit. The historian Herodotus, writing a generation later, would make of it an epic of his own, the struggle of liberty against despotism, of the many small against the one great. Through his words, Marathon passed from memory into myth, from a local victory into a universal story. Time, as it does, softened the details. The numbers grew grander, the speeches nobler, the miracles more wondrous. The ghosts of the fallen were said to walk the fields by moonlight, their armor faintly glowing as they marched in eternal patrol. Farmers told tales of phantom armies clashing in the distance on quiet nights. Marathon had become a sacred scar upon the earth where history and legend intertwined. The generations that followed reaped the fruits of that triumph. The golden age of Athens rose like dawn upon the ruins of war. Under Pericles, the city became the jewel of Greece, its acropolis crowned with marble temples that gleamed like flame in the sun. The Parthenon itself, dedicated to Athena the Defender, was the stone embodiment of Marathon's spirit. Inside, artists sculpted the battles of gods and giants, Greeks and barbarians, each figure a reflection of that eternal struggle between freedom and tyranny. In this flowering of art and thought, the Athenians found new ways to express the meaning of their past. The philosophers spoke of virtue and duty, of justice and reason. Socrates would one day walk the streets of the same city whose freedom had been bought by those who fought at Marathon. The democracy that had once been fragile became the foundation for ideas that would outlast empires. When men spoke of citizenship, of equality before the law, of the rights and responsibilities of the free, they were echoing the legacy of that plain in Attica, where men had chosen to fight rather than kneel. And yet, in the centuries to come, the light of Greece would fade. The Peloponnesian Wars would pit Athens against Sparta, brother against brother, until the land that had once stood united against Persia was torn apart by its own rivalries. Empire would replace alliance, tyranny would replace democracy, and the glory of the city-states would give way to Macedonian kings. But even then, the memory of Marathon endured. When Alexander, son of Philip, set forth to conquer the Persian Empire, he carried with him not only his father's sword, but the spirit of those who had fought a century and a half before. As his armies marched east, retracing the path of Darius and Xerxes in reverse, many saw it as the final act of Marathon's revenge, the West's answer to the East's ambition. When Alexander reached the ruins of Persepolis, he ordered them burned, not in fury but as a symbol, a cleansing fire. In that act, the circle was closed. The empire that had once sought to enslave Greece was now itself a memory. Marathon had outlived its conquerors. Through Rome, too, the legacy spread. The Romans admired Greek valor and adopted its myths as their own. To them, Marathon was the model of civic virtue, the proof that discipline and unity could overcome all odds. Centuries later, when Europe was reborn from the darkness of its own wars, scholars and revolutionaries looked back to Greece for inspiration. They found in Marathon not a mere story of spears and shields, but a symbol of human dignity, the belief that no tyranny is unassailable when men choose to stand together. The centuries turned to millennia, and still, the name endures. The field of Marathon lies quiet now, its grass swaying in the Aegean breeze, its tumulus rising softly against the sky. Yet every traveler who walks there feels the weight of what was done. The stones may be silent, but the earth remembers. It remembers the thunder of bronze, the cries of men who would not yield, the moment when history pivoted on the courage of the few. And far from that plain, across oceans and ages, the spirit of Marathon lives on in another form. When runners gather to test their endurance, when they race through cities and countrysides, the word they invoke, Marathon, carries within it the echo of that ancient day. The modern race recalls Pheidippides' legendary run, but beyond that, it recalls the very essence of the struggle. Perseverance, courage, and the triumph of will over impossibility. Each step upon the road is a whisper from the past, a tribute to the men who once ran not for glory, but for freedom. Thus, the story of Marathon is no longer confined to the 5th century before Christ. It belongs to all time. Its meaning has changed with each age, yet its heart remains the same. It speaks of defiance in the face of overwhelming power, of the belief that a single moment of courage can alter the destiny of nations. And perhaps that is why, even now, we remember. For the world still turns as it did then, empires still rise, and men still must choose whether to stand or kneel. The ghosts of Marathon are never far. They walk beside us whenever courage is demanded, whenever the few must face the many, whenever freedom must be earned anew. The Athenians who stood upon that plain did not know they were shaping history. They fought for their homes, their gods, their families. Yet from their choice came the echo that still resounds. From their defiance came the birth of an idea that men, though mortal, could shape eternity. And so beneath the wide Attic sky, where the sea meets the hills and the wind carries whispers from ages past, the tale of Marathon endures. It is written not only in stone or story, but in the soul of all who believe that courage and freedom are worth any cost. For there, on that ancient field, the world first learned what it meant to be free. The centuries rolled forward, and history carried the name of Marathon across the currents of time like a sacred ember that refused to fade. Empires rose and fell, kings were crowned and dethroned, cities built and burned, yet the meaning of that ancient clash endured, unbroken by distance or decay. For the Battle of Marathon was never merely about the clash of two armies, it was about the clash of two visions of the world. On one side stood Persia, the symbol of absolute authority, an empire that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of India, bound together by the will of a single sovereign. It was power made divine, order imposed from above, the vast machine of empire that sought to bring all things under its rule. On the other stood Greece, small, quarrelsome, defiant. A collection of city-states bound not by conquest, but by a shared spirit of independence, each proud of its laws, its gods, and its freedom. Marathon was the moment when those two worlds collided, and from that collision, something new emerged. The Athenians who stood on that field could not have imagined how far their defiance would echo. They fought not for philosophy or posterity, but for survival. Yet their victory lit a flame that would burn through the centuries, a flame of thought, of art, of governance, of liberty. For if men could resist the might of a god-king and prevail, then perhaps the destiny of the world was not written solely by those who ruled it, but by those who dared to stand against them. In the years that followed, Athens would transform the energy of that triumph into creation. The city that had faced annihilation became a cradle of genius. From the ashes of fear rose the marble of the Parthenon, gleaming like frozen sunlight upon the Acropolis. From the chaos of battle grew the order of philosophy, where men began to question the nature of justice, virtue, and truth. And in the Agora, under the open sky, the same citizens who had once raised their shields in war now raised their voices in debate, shaping the foundations of democracy. This was the true legacy of Marathon. Not only that a people had survived, but that they had chosen to build something greater from the victory. For in defending their freedom, they had discovered its worth. It was a fragile thing, easily lost, costly to defend, but precious beyond measure. The idea that the will of the many could guide the fate of the few was born, not in the comfort of peace, but in the crucible of war. And so, the spirit of Marathon became a thread woven through the fabric of Western civilization. Centuries later, when republics rose and tyrannies fell, when revolutions flared in distant lands, men looked back to that plain in Attica as if it were a sacred beginning. The American founders, when they spoke of liberty and the rights of man, drew upon the language of the Greeks. European scholars, when they rediscovered the texts of antiquity, found in them a mirror of their own struggles for freedom. The world that came after inherited not just the philosophy of Athens, but the courage of Marathon. Yet history, like the sea, is never still. It rises and recedes, shaping the shores of human destiny with each wave. The same currents that once carried the Persian fleets now carry our own ambitions, our own conflicts. And the questions that echoed across the plain of Marathon still whisper in our own time. What do we stand for? What would we fight to preserve? What is the worth of freedom? And who among us has the courage to defend it when the cost is high? There are moments in history when men stand at the edge of impossible odds, when the future hangs by a thread and the world holds its breath. Marathon was one of those moments. It reminds us that history is not made by those who possess the greatest power, but by those who possess the greatest resolve. 10,000 Athenians stood before an empire and changed the course of civilization. Their names may have faded from stone, but their spirit endures in every act of defiance against tyranny, in every stand made for justice and dignity. And there is something almost divine in that endurance. For though the gods of Greece have long since fallen silent, though their temples crumble and their myths turn to dust, the ideals they once inspired still live on. The courage of the hoplites, the unity of the phalanx, the belief that a free people could shape their own fate, all of these remain. The field of Marathon may lie quiet beneath the sun, but within that silence is the pulse of eternity. To walk upon that soil is to feel time dissolve, the sea glimmering to the east, the mountains rising to the west, and the wind carrying echoes of distant cries. One can almost see them. The line of shields gleaming in the dawn, the spears thrusting forward, the charge that shattered an empire's illusion of invincibility. And then the stillness, the aftermath, the beginning of something the world had never known before. A civilization built not upon submission, but upon choice. From that day forward, the word marathon would come to mean endurance. The endurance to fight, to run, to persist. The endurance of an idea that refuses to die. The endurance of liberty itself. It is no accident that in our modern age, when runners set forth to test their limits, they do so under that name. For each race is a tribute, not to speed, but to the unyielding spirit that first ran from Marathon to Athens, a spirit that declared, "We are free," before it collapsed and died. And perhaps that is the truest symbol of all, that freedom, like that final breath, is something earned through sacrifice. It demands everything, yet gives meaning to all. The Battle of Marathon was a clash that shaped the ancient world, but its reverberations did not stop there. It shaped the modern one as well. It gave birth to the belief that even the smallest people can defy the greatest power, that even the weakest voice can echo across the ages. That courage is the one force capable of bending the course of history. As the centuries continue to turn, as nations rise and fade like shadows at sunset, that truth remains unbroken. Somewhere within every act of resistance, within every fight for justice, within every defense of freedom, the spirit of Marathon breathes again. For the world is still a battlefield, not of spears and shields, but of ideas and convictions. The choice faced by the Athenians remains our own, whether to bow to the forces that seek to command us, or to stand firm, believing that a free soul is mightier than any empire. And so, the story continues. Not in the dust of ancient plains, but in the hearts of those who remember. The echo of Marathon is the heartbeat of history itself, a reminder that courage is timeless, that freedom is fragile, and that the price of both is eternal vigilance. When the sun sets over the Aegean and the waves wash softly against the Attic shore, it is said that the spirits of the fallen still rise in the twilight haze, standing once more upon that sacred ground. They gaze across the sea toward the horizon where the Persian ships once sailed, and in the whispering wind one might almost hear the murmur of their vow. So long as men cherish freedom, Marathon shall never die. The story of Marathon does not end upon its blood-soaked plain. History seldom pauses after a single victory, no matter how glorious. It merely draws breath. For even as Athens rejoiced, even as the songs of triumph echoed through her streets and garlands crowned her heroes, far to the east the great empire stirred again. In the royal palaces of Susa and Persepolis, news of the defeat carried like a bitter wind. The courtiers spoke in whispers, and the mighty King Darius brooded upon his throne. His pride, once as boundless as his dominion, had been wounded. How could the greatest empire on earth have been humbled by a handful of rebels clinging to a rocky peninsula at the edge of the known world? He swore vengeance, not merely upon Athens, but upon the very idea that men could defy him. He ordered preparations for a new campaign greater than the first. Messengers rode to the ends of his empire, calling upon satraps and generals, summoning ships and soldiers, horses and gold. But the fates had written another destiny. Before his armies could march, Darius fell to illness, leaving the throne to his son, a younger, fiercer monarch who burned with the same desire to avenge the humiliation of Persia. Xerxes, son of Darius, heir to the Achaemenid throne, would take up the task his father could not complete. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Bactria, he gathered his strength. It was said that when Xerxes' army set forth, the earth itself trembled beneath its weight. Across the Hellespont, he built bridges of ships to unite Asia with Europe. His fleets darkened the seas, his banners blotted out the horizon. The vengeance of Marathon was coming, and it would fall upon Greece with the force of a storm. And yet, beneath that looming shadow, the spirit born at Marathon did not falter. The Greeks quarreled as they always had, Athens and Sparta bickering over leadership, smaller cities choosing sides. But they remembered. They remembered that once, when the world had seemed equally hopeless, they had stood together and prevailed. They remembered the charge that had shattered the Persian lines and the courage that had turned men into legends. From that memory would come a new alliance, uneasy but powerful. For they understood now that Greece was not merely a collection of city-states but an idea, a flame too precious to surrender. And so they prepared once more to meet the tide. In the passes of the north, where the mountains rise like the walls of the world, a small band of warriors would make their stand. At Thermopylae, the Spartans would carve their names into eternity. And upon the sea at Salamis, the Athenians would strike a blow that would break the power of empire forever. Marathon was the first act, but not the last. It was the spark that kindled the fire that would consume an empire. As the centuries unfolded, the story of these battles became inseparable, forming a single epic of defiance, a song of the West against the East, of freedom against subjugation, of mortal courage against immortal ambition. And though history would later complicate those divisions, though time would blur the moral lines, the essence remained clear. The struggle begun at Marathon was not merely for land or power, but for the soul of civilization itself. Even now, when we speak of liberty, when we dream of justice, when we stand against forces greater than ourselves, we are speaking in the shadow of Marathon. The plain still whispers to us across millennia that courage matters, that unity is strength, that even the smallest among men can shape the fate of the world. And so the camera of history pans outward, from the quiet field of Marathon across the blue waters of the Aegean to the distant cliffs of Thermopylae, where another dawn waits to break. The sound of marching feet begins again, the drums of empire echoing like thunder across the mountains. The world holds its breath once more as the next chapter of destiny begins to unfold. For Marathon was not the end. It was the beginning. The first heartbeat in the long, unending struggle between freedom and fear, and as long as men remember, that heartbeat will never cease. The drums of empire rolled once more across the earth. From the palaces of Persepolis to the windswept plains of Media, the call went out. Vengeance. For a decade, the great king had dreamed of retribution, and now that dream was taking shape in steel and stone. Xerxes, son of Darius, had sworn before his court and his gods that the insult of Marathon would not go unanswered. The Persian Empire, vast beyond comprehension, would descend upon Greece like a storm from the east. They said his army drank rivers dry, and that the dust of its march turned day into twilight. From every corner of the empire they came, Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, Egyptians and Scythians, men from the mountains, men from the desert, men who had never seen the sea. They gathered in millions, it was said, though the truth was smaller and yet no less terrifying. Behind them came the fleets of Phoenicia and Egypt, bearing warships that filled the Aegean like a floating forest. The king himself rode among them, a god upon earth, seated high upon a golden chariot beneath a parasol of white silk. When Xerxes reached the shores of the Hellespont, he faced the waters that divided Asia from Europe, the boundary between empire and defiance. There, he commanded that the sea itself be conquered. Engineers from every province labored for months, binding hundreds of ships side by side, lashing them together with cables of flax and papyrus until they formed a bridge vast enough for armies to march across. When a storm broke it apart, Xerxes, in a fury, ordered the sea whipped and chained, as though punishing a disobedient servant. Then he built the bridge anew. Across that impossible passage marched the might of Persia. The hoofbeats of cavalry shook the earth. The banners of every nation under the great king fluttered in the salt wind. It was not merely an invasion, it was a procession of destiny. Xerxes sought not only to subdue Greece, but to erase it. Word of his coming reached the Greek cities like a shadow spreading over the land. Messengers galloped from polis to polis, their cries of warning echoing through the mountain passes. Many trembled, some surrendered, others turned their eyes to the gods. But in the south, where the rugged land of Laconia lay beneath the slopes of Mount Taygetus, one city did not flinch. Sparta had heard the call, and Sparta would answer. The Spartans were a people unlike any other in Greece. Their city had no walls, for they said their walls were the shields of their men. From birth, every Spartan boy was molded for war, hardened by hunger, trained by pain, taught to stand, to fight, and never to yield. Their law was simple: return with your shield or upon it. To them, courage was the highest virtue, death in battle the greatest honor. When the call went out to defend Greece, the Spartans looked not to comfort, nor to victory, but to duty. Their king, Leonidas, son of Anaxandridas, was chosen to lead a small force north to hold the narrow pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a natural choke point where the mountains of central Greece pressed close to the sea. There the Persians' vast numbers would count for little. There a few could hold against many. But the timing was cruel. It was the season of the Carnia festival, when Spartan law forbade war. Only a small vanguard could be sent before the full army followed. And so Leonidas chose 300 of his best, 300 men who had sons to carry their names, for he knew none would return. Alongside them marched allies from Thespiae, Thebes, and other cities, some 7,000 in all. They went not as conquerors, but as a shield for all of Greece. When they reached Thermopylae, the king surveyed the land. The pass was narrow, hemmed in by sheer cliffs and steaming springs from which the place took its name. The sea lapped close to the road, and the mountains rose like guardians beside it. Here, Leonidas saw, was where the tide could be stopped. His men built a wall of stone and timber to narrow the way further, and they prepared for the storm they knew would come. It did not take long. The vanguard of Xerxes' army soon appeared, glittering in the sun like a river of bronze. The king sent forth a herald, demanding the Greeks lay down their arms. Leonidas's reply was simple, carved into eternity with the edge of his words, "Molon Labe, come and take them." For 4 days Xerxes hesitated, expecting the Greeks to flee. When they did not, he ordered the assault. The first waves came in fury, the Medes and the Scythians rushing forward in ranks. But the Spartans and their allies fought as one, their bronze shields overlapping, their spears thrusting in deadly rhythm. The narrow pass swallowed the Persian numbers, their arrows fell harmlessly against the interlocked wall of shields. Again and again they charged, and again they were thrown back. The Greeks moved like a machine of flesh and will, their discipline unbroken, their courage unyielding. Then Xerxes sent in his elite, the Immortals, 10,000 warriors clad in fine armor, the pride of Persia. They advanced with precision, certain of victory. But at Thermopylae, even immortals could bleed. Leonidas' men met them with mockery, pushing them back, their spears splintering, their swords flashing in the sun. When the order was given to feign retreat, the Persians followed, and were slaughtered as the Greeks turned upon them with sudden fury. By nightfall, the ground was carpeted with the dead. Xerxes had lost thousands, the Greeks only a few. The king, watching from his throne of war, could scarcely believe what he saw. He had brought the world to Greece, and yet these few stood against him as though they were gods. For 2 more days, the slaughter continued. The Persians came in endless waves, and still the Greeks held the line. The narrow pass became a furnace of screams and dust, the air thick with the scent of death and salt and sweat. But then, fate turned. A Greek traitor named Ephialtes came to Xerxes by night and revealed a secret path through the mountains, a way to outflank the defenders. Leonidas learned of it as dawn approached. He knew then that the end had come. Calling his allies, he ordered most to withdraw, but he and his 300 Spartans, along with a few hundred Thespians and Thebans who chose to stay, would remain. They would fight to the last man, buying time for Greece to rally. As the morning mist lifted, they took up their positions for the final stand. Leonidas moved among his men, his voice calm, his eyes fierce. He spoke not of death, but of duty, of glory, of the honor of standing where history itself would remember them. When the Persians advanced from both sides, the Greeks met them with the roar of lions. Their spears were broken, their shields shattered, yet still they fought, their short swords flashing like fire. In the chaos, Leonidas fell, pierced by arrows and spears, his body surrounded by those who would not let it be taken. His death ignited his men's fury. They fought on, dragging the fallen king's body back, defending it with their last breath. When at last the final line was broken, when the Persians surged over them, the surviving Spartans fought with bare hands and teeth until they were buried beneath the tide. When it was done, the great king surveyed the field of the dead. He had his victory, but it was an empty one. The cost was terrible, and the delay had allowed the Greeks to prepare. Though the Spartans had fallen, their defiance burned brighter than ever. Xerxes would learn in time that Thermopylae had not been the end of Greece, but the beginning of his own undoing. For even as he marched south, Athens was already emptying, its people fleeing to the island of Salamis. There, upon the sea, the next great battle awaited, the battle that would decide the fate of empires. The smoke of burning Athens curled into the sky, black ribbons twisting above the Acropolis where once stood the temples of the gods. Xerxes watched from his golden throne as the city burned, his vengeance seemingly complete. The streets that had defied his father now lay in ruin, the marble stones shattered, the statues of Athena toppled into dust. He had conquered the greatest city of Greece, or so he believed. But below the ashes, far across the narrow straits of Salamis, the true heart of Athens still lived. For its people had not been broken. They had fled to the sea. Themistocles, the cunning statesman and general of Athens, had seen this moment coming years before. When others argued for more hoplites, more land armies to face the Persians, he had argued for ships. He who commands the sea, he had said, commands the future. Under his guidance, Athens had built a navy greater than any Greece had ever known, hundreds of triremes, sleek wooden vessels driven by rows of oarsmen and crowned with bronze rams. Now, as Xerxes' forces poured south, those ships had become the last wall of Greece. But the Greek alliance was fractured and fearful. Many argued to fall back to the Isthmus of Corinth, abandoning Attica entirely and fighting on the mainland. To stand at sea against Persia's massive fleet seemed madness. Yet Themistocles, with his gift for persuasion and deceit, refused to yield. He knew that only in the narrow straits of Salamis could the smaller, nimbler Greek ships offset the Persians' overwhelming numbers. There, the sea itself would favor them, as Thermopylae had favored the Spartans. He sent messages, some true, some false, to the Greek allies, and even to Xerxes himself, feeding the great king's arrogance. He let word slip that the Greeks were in disarray, planning to flee under cover of night. Xerxes took the bait. He ordered his vast armada, over 1,000 ships from Phoenicia, Egypt and Ionia, to block the exits of the straits and trap the Greeks inside. He would crush them at dawn. That night, the waters of the Saronic Gulf shimmered beneath a pale moon. From his throne upon a golden cliff overlooking the bay, Xerxes watched as his navy spread across the darkened sea, torches burning like stars upon the water. Below, the Greek fleet lay silent in the narrow waters between Salamis and the mainland. On those decks, men whispered prayers to Poseidon, to Athena, to their ancestors. They knew what awaited them. Some were afraid, some were calm. All were resolute. Themistocles walked among them, his cloak heavy with salt air, his mind alight with calculation. He spoke softly to the captains, reminding them that this was not a battle for one city, but for all of Greece, for the idea of freedom itself. "Tomorrow," he said, "the sea will belong to those who believe they can win." At dawn, a stillness hung over the straits, the moment before the storm. Then came the sound of drums, the thunder of Persian oars beating in unison as the great fleet advanced. The morning sun struck the water, flashing off bronze and steel. The Persian ships, vast and heavy, surged forward in ranks, their prows slicing through the waves. Xerxes leaned forward on his throne, eager for the spectacle. But the Greeks were ready. From within the narrow channel, their triremes surged forth with the cry of Eleliou, a sound that split the morning air. The wooden hulls crashed together, the bronze rams of the Greeks striking deep into the sides of the Persian ships. Oars shattered, men fell screaming into the sea, the water turning red with blood and foam. The Persians tried to maneuver, but there was no room. Their numbers, once their strength, became their undoing. In the crowded straits, their great fleet tangled upon itself, their ships colliding, their oars locking. Themistocles' trap had sprung perfectly. From the flanks came the Athenian and Aeginetan squadrons, striking like wolves among sheep. The sea roared with the din of battle, the splintering of timber, the clash of steel, the cries of men. The narrow waters that had seemed a cage to the Greeks became a weapon in their hands. Among the waves, individual acts of heroism and horror unfolded. Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus and ally of Persia, commanded her own ship with ruthless cunning. When pursued by a Greek trireme, she rammed a friendly vessel to confuse her pursuers. Watching from afar, Xerxes mistook the act for brilliance and praised her, never realizing she had slain her own allies to survive. Elsewhere, Athenian rowers fought not only the enemy but exhaustion itself, pulling with bloodied hands as flaming wrecks drifted past. The sea was alive with wreckage, splintered ships, floating corpses, broken shields, and still the Greeks pressed on. When the Persian flagship fell, its admiral slain, panic rippled through the fleet. The cry went up, "The great king has been deceived." From his vantage point, Xerxes could see it, the smoke, the confusion, the chaos. His fleet was collapsing before his eyes. What had begun as a triumph became a nightmare. By midday, the waters of Salamis were littered with the shattered remnants of Persian pride. Hundreds of ships lay wrecked or aflame, thousands of men drowned or cut down. The once invincible armada was gone. As the surviving ships fled toward open water, the Greeks gave chase, their victory cries echoing across the waves. Themistocles stood on the deck of his ship, watching as the great fleet of Persia disappeared over the horizon. He knew then that Greece had been saved, not by numbers, but by wit, by courage, and by the will of free men. On the shore, Xerxes sat in stunned silence. The dream of conquering Europe had slipped through his fingers like water. His advisors begged him to retreat, warning that the army without its fleet would starve in hostile lands. The great king, swallowing his pride, ordered a withdrawal. He left behind a portion of his forces under Mardonius to continue the war, but the heart of his empire turned back toward Asia. The tide had turned, but Greece was not yet safe. The next year, Mardonius returned to finish what Xerxes could not. He marched north through the ravaged lands of Attica, burning what was left of Athens and challenging the Greeks once more. But now the city-states were united as never before. Under the Spartan general Pausanias, they gathered at the plains of Plataea. There, amid the rolling fields and under the open sky, the last great battle of the Persian invasion would be fought. The fields of Boeotia lay quiet under the early morning sun, their gentle hills betraying none of the violence that was to come. To the north, the remnants of Xerxes' army, hardened, embittered, yet still vast, marched southward under the command of Mardonius, determined to salvage the honor of Persia. Their banners fluttered in the wind, and the ground trembled beneath the weight of their armor and boots. They believed that the Greeks, fractured and exhausted, could still be crushed beneath the tide of empire. But the Greeks were ready. The Athenians, the Plataeans, and the Spartans, joined by contingents from Corinth, Megara, and other city-states, had assembled into a force greater than any they had fielded at Thermopylae or Salamis. They knew the stakes. If they fell here, all of Greece might be enslaved. Yet they also knew their own strength, the unity that Marathon had first inspired, the courage that Thermopylae had demanded, and the cunning that Salamis had proven. Pausanias, the Spartan commander, moved among his troops with calm authority. He reminded them of their heritage, of the men who had stood at Marathon, who had charged at Thermopylae, who had rode into Salamis and emerged victorious. "This is not the moment for fear," he said. "This is the moment for honor, for Greece, for freedom itself." The soldiers tightened their grips on spears and shields, their eyes reflecting the light of the rising sun. Mardonius's forces advanced, the hum of thousands of soldiers marching as one into the fields of Plataea. Persian cavalry scouted ahead, their horses snorting and stamping, the riders' curved bows poised. The Greek forces formed a phalanx, shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield, spears bristling like the teeth of a living wall. Each man was a blade, each formation a single organism of discipline and resolve. The battle began with the clash of cavalry and skirmishers. Persian archers unleashed volleys of arrows, blackening the sky, but the Greek shields held fast. The Spartans, in the center, advanced slowly, inexorably, like a glacier of bronze. Around them, the Athenians struck at the flanks, the hoplites pushing forward in disciplined waves. The ground trembled as the main forces collided. The Persians, with their curved swords and long spears, pressed hard, but the Greeks had learned from every previous engagement. Their phalanx was unyielding. When a Persian soldier fell, another took his place. When a gap threatened to form, reinforcements flowed in seamlessly, as if the formation were alive. Hours passed, and the battle became a test of endurance as much as skill. The sun climbed higher, burning down on the bronze armor, the dust rising in choking clouds. Men shouted, swords clashed, shields splintered. Yet still the Greeks held. Mardonius realized that the advantage of numbers had been neutralized. The tight formations of the hoplites, the cohesion of their strategy, were too much for even his best-trained troops. Then, in a decisive move, the Greek wings enveloped the Persian center. The Athenians and Plataeans surged forward, cutting off retreat, while the Spartans pressed the heart of the enemy line. The chaos became complete. Mardonius's cavalry was destroyed or scattered, infantry units were surrounded and overwhelmed. One by one, the Persian divisions collapsed under the relentless pressure. In the midst of the carnage, Mardonius fell. Struck down in the heart of his army, the Persian command faltered. Without leadership, the remnants of the invaders fled the field in disorder, pursued by Greek forces who spared few. The once mighty army that had threatened to subdue all of Greece was shattered, its soldiers either dead or in full retreat. The victory was total. The Greek allies, though battered and bloodied, had prevailed. Greece had survived, not through chance, but through courage, unity, and the indomitable will to remain free. The plains of Plataea became the final testament to the spirit first seen at Marathon, refined at Thermopylae, tested at Salamis. In the aftermath, Athens and her allies rebuilt, honoring the dead, commemorating the fallen. The scale of destruction was immense, yet the triumph cemented a new sense of identity among the Greek city-states. They had faced the might of an empire and lived to tell the tale. They had proven that freedom was worth every cost, and that even the greatest tyranny could be resisted with courage, discipline, and unity. Across the seas in Persia, Xerxes retreated to Susa, humiliated yet still mighty in name. The empire had endured, but the lesson of Greece was indelibly written upon its history. The spirit of free men cannot be conquered by mere numbers or might. For Greece, the victories at Marathon, Salamis, Thermopylae, and Plataea became the cornerstone of identity, the foundation upon which philosophy, art, and democracy would flourish. The tales of valor and defiance were recounted for generations, inspiring poets, historians, and citizens alike. Heroes were immortalized, not because they survived, but because they had chosen to stand, to fight, and to defend liberty against impossible odds, and thus ended the Persian invasions, leaving a legacy that shaped the Western world. Greece remained free, its city-states intact, its culture vibrant, its ideals enduring. The echoes of those battles, the courage of the few against the many, the triumph of strategy and spirit over brute force, would resonate across millennia, a reminder that freedom, once seized, is never lightly surrendered. In the quiet of the plains, where the blood-soaked soil slowly returned to grass, one could almost hear the whispers of the fallen. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Names that had become more than history, more than legend. Names that would live as long as men remembered what it meant to be free. The story of Greece and Persia was over, yet its lessons endured. The clash of empires had not only shaped the land, but had forged the ideals that would guide humanity for centuries. Courage, unity, strategy, and the unbreakable will to defend liberty against overwhelming odds. The battlefield was silent now, but history would never forget. The soul of Greece had survived, and with it, the hope that even the smallest and weakest could stand against the greatest and strongest, and that the choices of a few could echo through eternity. The sun set over the plains of Greece, casting long shadows across fields that had once been drenched in blood. The voices of the fallen, silenced by time, seemed to whisper on the wind. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Each name carried the weight of courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable human spirit. These battles were not merely events, they were lessons etched into the soul of a civilization, reminders that freedom must be earned and defended at every age. From the quiet hills of Attica to the rugged cliffs of Laconia, from the narrow straits of Salamis to the rolling plains of Boeotia, Greece had withstood an empire, not by wealth, not by numbers, not by the grandeur of kings, but by the unity, discipline, and courage of ordinary men and women willing to face impossible odds. The hoplite, the rower, the citizen soldier, they had all become instruments of history, shaping not only the fate of their own lands but the destiny of the world. These victories did more than preserve city-states. They preserved an idea that people could govern themselves, that freedom could survive the shadow of empire, that the courage of a few could inspire generations yet unborn. Athens would rise from the ashes of war to build temples, compose music, debate philosophy, and invent democracy. Sparta would carry its code of honor across centuries, teaching that discipline and courage are eternal virtues. And the stories of heroism would travel far beyond the Mediterranean, carried in the hearts and minds of all who would hear them. The Persian Empire retreated, its ambition checked, its power diminished, yet history would remember not only its might, but the resolve of those who defied it. In the chronicles of Herodotus, in the poems of later bards, in the memory of every Greek who told the story to a child, the wars became myth as much as history. Timeless tales of valor, strategy, and sacrifice. They became the foundation upon which Western civilization would build its ideals: justice, democracy, civic duty, and the belief that tyranny is never invincible. And so the plains of Marathon, the pass of Thermopylae, the waters of Salamis, and the fields of Plataea live on, not just as places on a map, but as symbols. Symbols of courage in the face of impossible odds, of unity against overwhelming force, of the enduring power of freedom. They remind us that history is not written solely by the powerful, but by those who dare to resist, who choose to fight for something larger than themselves. Even today, as we walk through cities, debate in assemblies, or strive to preserve liberties in our own time, the echoes of those ancient battles speak to us. They remind us that greatness is not inherited, it is earned. That freedom is fragile, it must be defended. That courage is eternal, it inspires across generations. The wars are over, yet the lesson remains. The Greeks faced the greatest empire the world had ever known, and they survived. They transformed fear into strategy, chaos into unity, desperation into triumph. Their choices, their bravery, and their sacrifices created a legacy that cannot be destroyed, a story that continues to shape our understanding of courage, duty, and liberty. And when we remember them, we are reminded of the same truth they lived: that the soul of a free people, once awakened, cannot be extinguished. That even against impossible odds, courage and conviction can alter the course of history. That the actions of a few can echo across centuries, inspiring countless generations to stand firm, to fight, and to believe in something greater than themselves. The story of Greece and Persia is no longer simply a chapter in a history book. It is a testament, a mirror for every age, every people, and every individual who would rise against the impossible, who would defend what is just, and who would, against all odds, choose freedom. The winds of the Aegean sweep across the plains once more, carrying whispers of heroism and sacrifice. The sun sinks behind distant hills, casting the world into twilight, and in that quiet, the voices of the past seem to speak again, reminding us that courage, unity, and the will to be free are eternal. For as long as men remember the fields of Marathon, the cliffs of Thermopylae, the straits of Salamis, and the plains of Plataea, the spirit of Greece will endure, and so will the hope that freedom, though challenged, can prevail. The story has ended, but its echoes continue. Across time and space, in every act of defiance, in every choice to stand, the legacy of the Greeks lives on. An eternal reminder that even the smallest spark of courage can illuminate the darkness of empire and shape the destiny of the world.